Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And we are friends who are following Jesus, who help each other make sense of the world. One of the puzzling questions to try to make sense of in the political world over the last 10, 15 years is what has happened to the conservative movement. If you go back 15, 20 years ago, and compare the conservative movement from then to now, it's hardly recognizable. You go back 15, 20 years ago, there were many elements substantively in terms of the issues which I would have agreed with. I would have identified with those particular substantive takes of the conservative movement. Now, not so much. What has happened substantively to the modern conservative movement? Now, I think a quick answer would be, well, Donald J. Trump. But I don't think that explains the substantive transformation of the conservative movement, because Trump is not an original substantive thinker. He's simply channeling sentiments that have been brewing and existing for a long time, giving them a particular voice and a brazenness to him. But he's not an original, innovative political philosopher by any means. And another reason why I think we need to look beyond Trump is we have to realize that the transformation of the American conservative movement falls right in line with the transformation of conservative movements across the West. That globally, there has been the rise of the far-right movements across the West, across Europe, in many, many countries, that has a lot of genetic similarity and then obviously transcends Trump. Now, some of the factors driving the radicalization of the right are the same factors driving the radicalization of the left. You have social media that are creating homogenous communities and echo chambers that lead to greater radicalization. But again, those are factors affecting both left and right. It doesn't explain substantively what has been transforming those on the right. And I think to answer that question, if you look at survey after survey of conservative movements, both in the United States and in Europe, you find one concern across all countries that dominates all others at a substantive level, and that is immigration. Immigration on the right far outstrips most other concerns and is the sort of weaving consistent theme across conservative movements transnationally. And it's differentiated from what's happening on the left because immigration is far lower consistently among the substantive concerns for those on the progressive side. You just need to look at, as a great example of this, a great study done by The Atlantic's Barton Gellman, published in January of 2022, where he studied the backgrounds of the January 6th insurrectionists. And he found that the best predictor for who would be more likely to participate in an act of violence, it was not economics, it was not their economic status, because the participants were mostly well off. It wasn't either whether they lived in politically red or blue states. The factor that most accurately predicted whether somebody would participate in violence on January 6th was which county they came from and whether the white population was declining or not in that county, really due, again, to immigration. Immigration is really driving substantively the transformation of the current conservative party. And the thing to understand is that these rioters on January 6th, like most of the conservative movement on immigration, are not driven by purely rational arguments. It's not like the January 6th insurrectionists were waving detailed policy studies showing that, wait, we've discovered that immigration actually is bad for the economy, because those studies don't exist. Almost all of the respectable, robust studies on the actual socioeconomic effect of immigration is that overwhelmingly it's positive, not without some costs, but overwhelmingly positive. So this substantive transformation is not driven by purely rational arguments. But I think it would also be a mistake to simply dismiss this transformation as purely irrational, as if, and in particular, driven by racism, for instance. I absolutely believe racism is present in the modern conservative far right movement. But I think it's a mistake to just boil everything down to racism, which in its purest form is simply irrational. Again, I think racism is present, but I don't think it explains everything, because between the purely rational and the purely irrational is a vast realm of human experience. And that is what you would call the emotional. The emotional. And to understand the emotional drivers of the conservative viewpoints on immigration, I think you really have to dig into one particular emotion, which is anxiety. Anxiety. Immigration is like so much of our political landscape. It is bathed in anxiety, and you can't really map out immigration and substantively what people think, believe, act around immigration if you can't map out the emotional contours of anxiety. And once you put on that lens of anxiety, I think you can map out more of its true nature and also spot potential opportunities for engagement. This is why I wrote the book, Anxiety, Opportunity, really before starting the work on politics with the after party. The one leads to the other, because I think to understand politics, you have to understand anxiety, and to understand the substantive politics of immigration, which so defines the political landscape, you have to understand the emotional undercurrents of anxiety. I was recently invited to speak at the National Immigration Forum gathering in Ohio, a gathering of pastors who pastor communities that are in one way or another affected by immigration. And I gave a talk there, and the purpose of my talk there was really to help connect immigration to anxiety. And by making that connection, try to help the pastors there to see that as spiritual leaders, as spiritual Christian leaders, they have a unique opportunity to speak and engage with issues of immigration with an understanding of the anxiety present, because Christians of all people have good news to say about anxiety. And that's really the purpose of this talk. So I wanted to share this talk with you. You're going to hear the talk, which is about 40 minutes or so, and then a really excellent panel discussion that comes after it. So hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Redeeming Babel we produce content that helps Christians make sense of the world. And so we have podcasts, we have courses, and we have a book out on anxiety. And we are co-sponsoring this event because all of you gathered in this room, are a very special gathering. You are a very special gathering. And the reason, rather than me just declare that, let me diagram how special you are. So you are special because you represent the intersection of three concentric circles. Classic Venn diagram represents this room. So one of the circles that's present in this room are Christians, as Christy said. I know not everyone here identifies as a Christian, but many of you do. Many of you, in fact, lead Christian communities, are pastors or other leaders, or you yourselves are a Christian as a leader in a different setting, whether in business or in law enforcement. Or even if you're not yourself identified as a Christian, you recognize that in a community like Ohio, the Christian culture matters deeply for the well-being of your community. So you're here either as Christians or as people who appreciate the role of Christians in this world. But that's not all, because the other circle that you are overlapping is immigration. And the fact that this is overlapping Christians immigration already makes you very special, because there are many, many, many Christians who do not care about immigration. Right? And there are many, many people who care very deeply about immigration who are not informed by Christian values or principles. Right? So the fact that you're here on both already creates you as a very special overlap. And then to add on to that, the topic for today that we are talking about is anxiety. So that puts you square in the middle here, which makes you a very special group of people who recognize the importance of these three things: being Christians, thinking, acting Christianly in the world, around immigration specifically, and recognizing the importance of anxiety. And why I wanted to sponsor this event and come here all the way from California is because I want to be around people like you, because I also stand at that intersection. I am a Christian. I'm a public Christian, speaking publicly to Christians through podcasts, books, courses, and so forth. I am an immigrant myself, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm also anxious. I have a lifelong sufferer of chronic anxiety, and I'll tell more about that as well. And I've written a book to reflect about this spiritual, theological nature of anxiety. So Christian immigration anxiety, that's me. I'm all over that. I'm here. I'm glad I'm here with you today. And mostly what I'm going to be talking about this morning is really about how, as Christians, how do we make better sense of anxiety? So really the Christian anxiety overlap is where I'll spend most of my time. But it's important for us, since we're here with the National Immigration Forum, to recognize just, first of all, this overlap. Why, if you care about immigration, you really need to understand and come to terms with anxiety. That this overlap between anxiety and immigration is quite powerful. And the reason for that is rooted in the very nature of what anxiety is. Right? What is anxiety? We have very symptomatic feelings of anxiety. Our breath gets quick, our chest tightens. There's very physical symptoms, but the existential nature, the very identity of anxiety is this. It is the natural human fear of future loss. So let me just break that down for a second. It's natural. It is what all human beings will experience to varying levels. We exist on a spectrum, but it's natural. It is built into the human experience. It's hardwired into our biology, actually, in the fight or flee complex that we have, hardwired, right? So we have a natural human fear of future, right? And that's what anxiety is. We are fearing something that it's not happening right now. It's happening that we fear could happen in the future, and that fear is of a future loss. We're going to lose something we value. That's what anxiety is. And once we understand that anxiety is a natural human fear of future loss, we can understand why this overlap is so powerful. Because the immigration experience is baked into the immigration experience is the fear of future loss. You cannot be involved in some way in immigration and not feel the fear of future loss. On both sides, whether you're an immigrant or you're on a community receiving immigrant, it involves anxiety because it involves the fear of future loss. And to illustrate that, let me just say my own personal example of this. That's me. This is a picture in 1972, Taipei International Airport. This is me, my two sisters, and my mom wearing the leis. We are about to board the plane to come to the United States. And that's me as 3 years old. And take a look at those faces. What do you see? What do you see? Well, look at my mom. She has a fairly, tight-lipped smile that I think hides a great deal of anxiety. Why is she feeling anxiety? Well, for one thing, first of all, my dad is not in the picture, right? So she's alone, as we're taking 3 kids by herself. My dad had immigrated a year and a half earlier in the classic chain migration pattern, not Chang, Curtis Chang, like chain, C-H-A-I-N, migration pattern, right? Where one person goes first, right? And that's what he did. We hadn't seen each other for a year and a half, so that's probably some of her anxiety. But she's also fearing even more greater loss, even as she anticipates reunion with her husband. The 2 people next to her are her closest childhood friends. And she knows at that moment she's probably not going to see them for a very long time, perhaps ever. I mean, this is 1972, cost of airfare travel from Taiwan. There's a great deal of likelihood she will not see them again, right? So there is the fear that this is the last time I see my childhood friends. She's going, and she knows she's got to go and make a living. And she is coming from a different immigration class than the stereotypical highly educated Asian immigrant class. She only had a high school education. My dad, who immigrated first, only got as far as 6th grade. So we were of the blue collar, lower class immigration stream from Asia. So she's fearing the potential loss of livelihood, that she would have been able to make it in Taiwan. Will she lose that in America? Their motivation to a great extent in immigrating was for us, the 3 of us. It's Amy, Bertie, and Curtis, ABC. And they they wanted, well, we want a better life for them. But we were doing okay. We were doing well in school. We were thriving as kids. Would that happen in this brand new country that they knew very little about? None of us spoke English. All right, so you can imagine the potential loss of well-being that faced us. And that, again, is, I think, etched in my mom's face. The kids don't exactly look, like super thrilled, do we? And look at me. This is classic Curtis Chang response to anxiety. I'm trying to figure things out here. I'm trying to figure out, how do I get around this? How do I deal with this anxiety? And to understand what I'm trying to figure out, let me tell you what I was doing on the plane. On the plane, I was telling them, I could not stop talking. I was telling them, you know what I'm going to do? You know what I'm going to do? When we get off the plane, I'm going to hide behind mom, and dad is going to think I didn't come, right? Now, it's a very odd response for a kid, for a 3-year-old. What was I doing, right? And this is all about, I was actually trying to deal with my anxiety, because you have to understand, I'm 3.5 years old. I have not seen my dad for about 1.5 years. I've only seen pictures and very occasional expensive phone calls, right? So why am I wanting to hide behind my dad and playing it off as a joke? It's because I'm anxious. I'm anxious that I'm actually afraid he's not going to recognize me, right? And I am also, perhaps in an unnamed way, I'm afraid I'm not going to recognize him. So I wanted to hide. And that just shows you how the whole experience of immigration from the immigrant side is so bathed with anxiety, because there's loss wherever you go. The immigrant experience is defined by you are leaving something. So of course you're losing things, and you're going to a very uncertain future, which may very well be filled with very grievous losses. Even for a 3.5-year-old, I felt that, I experienced that. Right? And even when I was about to experience what seems like a reunion again with my dad, I was actually experiencing the potential loss of that, and hence the anxiety. So that's why we need to understand anxiety, because immigration is bathed with anxiety. And it's not just on the immigrant side. It's also on the communities receiving these immigrants. We immigrated to a community called Rogers Park, one of the northernmost neighborhoods in Chicago. Rogers Park was, for many years in the early 20th century, actually a middle class, kind of white-collar-ish community. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, it was trying to respond to a national housing shortage that was, triggered by the return of the veterans coming back from World War II. So it began to, in zoning laws, have more subdivided housing in the houses, and especially the apartments, which meant, of course, that housing became more affordable in Rogers Park, which meant it became more attractive to immigrants. Now, in the 50s, when this was happening, the immigrant class mainly came from Europe, people fleeing war-torn Europe. A lot of Eastern European refugees, Polish, Italians, flooded into what previously had been a mostly kind of WASP Rogers Park, right? So already in the 1950s, Rogers Park was experiencing change and loss. It was losing its old character of its community already. But at least it was with people that they could at least kind of like recognize, yeah, they're like, Europeans, whites, we sort of get them. And so they were struggling, Rogers Park was, but it was doing okay in making room for that. In 1965, the United States immigration policy changed significantly with the 1965 immigration reform. So before that, immigration policies had been heavily sort of biased towards white Europeans. If you remember, we're still in 1965 off of the legacy of immigration policy set in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was really trying to bar immigration from Asia and from Chinese. So I'm a Chinese American. I am the one people group that the United States has passed laws to say, you can't ever come here. Okay, that was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And it took up until 1965 in the Civil Rights Movement to kind of America to catch up to that reality. And so the 1965 opened the borders in a significant way to immigrants from Asia. And that's the immigration flow that my family was part of in 1972. So already just trickling into that, we were kind of on the front edges of immigration, of Asian immigration into Rogers Park. And that was a new thing for Rogers Park. You can see this in my kindergarten photograph from St. Ignatius School in kindergarten. I am the only Asian face in that whole class, right? And that was new for people. And I could feel, you know how I talked about how anxiety pervades immigration, and it's so bathed that it pervades even down at the kid level. I could feel it even in my fellow kindergarten class, that they felt strange, uncomfortable around me, around new person. They would look at me funny. They would do the kind of this, right? And they would ask me like, do you see things in a narrow, kind of like a narrow slant? And again, I suppose some of it was just kids being mean, but a lot of it was the unknown. They just had never met a Chinese person before. And they were somewhat curious, but they were also felt a little strange, a little threatened by the presence of the new. And we felt that throughout Rogers Park, right? You know, that we would get looks, we would get comments, we would get whispers, we would sometimes get taunted as we moved through there. And again, some of this is just people being mean, but I think to a great extent, it is bathed in anxiety. They had never seen a Chinese family walking through Rogers Park before. What did this mean? Did this mean for them, in a community that already had been going through a lot of change, a lot of loss in its original character? You think about somebody who had been living there for 60, 70 years, used to what it's been like, already experiencing the change in the 50s, now thinking, is this neighborhood going to just completely be something that I don't recognize anymore? That is not home for me, right? And this is the pervasive reality of immigration wherever you go. Not just in the US, but internationally. Wherever immigration rises, anxiety rises among the receiving community, fear, and that infects so many things, including politics, where poll after poll shows the fear of immigration is a leading political issue that galvanizes people precisely because it touches deeply on their anxiety. Which is why, to understand this overlap is so crucial. Given that anxiety and immigration are so tightly linked, how then as Christians, how does that change things? And what I want to talk about mostly then today is how does it change things here, and what do we need to change actually in this area of overlap as Christians as we deal with anxiety? Because we know we have to deal with anxiety not just for ourselves, but really for our presence in the world, because we know anxiety pervades all issues that are afflicting our world in politics and particularly in immigration, right? So, how as Christians ought we deal with and understand anxiety? That's why I wrote the book that I did called The Anxiety Opportunity. And the very title of it conveys my belief that we actually need to redraw that space of that intersection between Christians and anxiety, that we need to redraw it because it has been we need to reframe how Christians deal with anxiety. And the reason is found in the very title, which is meant to be provocative, right? The anxiety opportunity, that's not two words that usually are paired together, right? Anxiety and opportunity. Usually we use a different word than opportunity. We use a word like problem, right? Anxiety is a problem, right? And it certainly does feel like it is a problem, and in fact, a growing problem that threatens to flood our world and our communities. Like we've been hit with this tidal wave of anxiety. There's just a few statistics we can show. The percentage of college students suffering from anxiety disorders. In 2010, it was 1 in 10. Right? In 2019, this has gone higher even now, it was already 1 in 4. It's higher now, right? In 9 years that is a flood wave, right? That's a tsunami of anxiety. Think about another snapshot, the teen girl crisis. According to the most recent best data we have from National Institutes of Health, 57% of them are suffering in a significant way from some anxiety and depression. In my church, I don't know a single family that doesn't have some teenager, especially girls, who are suffering from anxiety or depression. Right? 57%. 30% have contemplated suicide because of the suffering of anxiety and depression. That's how profound. This is a tidal wave of anxiety hitting us. So we do have an anxiety problem, and it's one I'm familiar with because I have an anxiety problem. I'm standing here because of my anxiety problem. I am a former pastor of an evangelical covenant church in California. And now, the reason why I say former is because of anxiety. So when I took over as the pastor of this church, as the senior pastor of the church, it was one of the most sort of fastest growing churches in the Bay Area in this sort of emergent church movement, that was called. I took over from the founding senior pastor, right? Some of you guys already know. I can tell there's pastors in the room because this guy's shaking his head. He's like, I know where this story is going. You know where the story is going. It turns out, I didn't quite grasp this, it's really, really hard to take over from the founding senior pastor. And you know what else makes it really hard to take over a church that's grown? And this is in Silicon Valley. So this is a church that grew up in Silicon Valley, right in the middle of the dot-com boom in the early 2000s. And you know what makes taking over even harder is when the community experiences the dot-com bust of the mid-2000s. And so that, if you don't remember, this is back in the mid-2000s, huge exodus of people from the whole region, very rapidly. Incomes go way down, giving declines drastically, and suddenly we have this large church, large staff team, and a vastly shrinking attendance and giving, right? With a guy who is leading his first church. And I felt like I was in over my head. And the way I cope with anxiety is, as that little 3.5-year-old does, is I come up with little plans and scenarios. Like, I start thinking, what do I do? How do I solve this? And so forth, that. And you know, when I get really stuck in thinking that, it's at night. Right? That's when I cannot shut my brain down because I'm thinking of, how do I deal with this? How do I come up with a plan? How do I get around this? Right? And so I started having more trouble with my sleep. Started out sleeping about 7.5 hours a night, then that went down to about 6, and then 5, and then I was sleeping about 3 hours, for a few weeks. And then I went through a 2-week period where I did not fall asleep consciously at all. I must have experienced like micro sleep because you just can't survive that way, but I don't remember actually falling asleep for 2 weeks in a row. My system was so activated with anxiety, right? So my mind was so churning, I could not turn off for 2 weeks. And I remember around day 10 of this prolonged period of insomnia, I was alone. Fortunately, I was alone in the house by myself. And I just started screaming. I was just screaming, just make it stop. I was like, God, just make it stop, right? And then I had a moment of clarity. I thought, oh, this is how Guantanamo Bay works. They practice sleep deprivation. It's like, oh, this is why Geneva Convention has sort of deemed sleep deprivation as a form of torture. It's not just you're tired. You feel like you're fracturing. You're psychically breaking apart. And then you don't easily recover from a catastrophic experience of anxiety like that. Even after I started taking meds, finally getting under psychiatric care, seeing a therapist, the harshest symptoms of that anxiety went away, but I went into a long period of a very dark depression and then a dark spiritual night of the soul. And I can't, that's why I'm a former pastor. I've never pastored at another church again because I was like, that experience broke me. So I know the anxiety problem, right? And yet, I stand here as the author of a book called The Anxiety Opportunity. The Anxiety Opportunity. Because the news I have for you is that anxiety is a problem, but it is also the most profound opportunity we have as human beings, and as Christians especially, for growth, for spiritual growth. But we have to ask the question, why? And that was a question I asked. Even months after I recovered, was like, why? Why did this happen? Why did this tidal wave of anxiety overwhelm me? Now, when you ask the question why, you can ask it from sort of 2 ways. You can ask it from a systemic level way, and then you can also ask it from a structural way, from a sort of responsive way. Let me be more clear about that. So let me use this question by an analogy. So let's talk about another tidal wave that hit the world at one point. Hurricane Katrina, if you remember, early 2000s, overwhelmed New Orleans. It was a catastrophe. if we ask the question, why did Katrina happen? We can ask it from a very high-level causal factor. We're like, well, it was an unprecedented confluence of high-pressure system, tidal forces, climate change, injecting more energy into weather systems, all the complex causal systems that led to the storm of a Category 5, a perfect storm, Category 5 hurricane. And that's one way you can ask why. And if you apply that to anxiety, to me, you could say, well, it was a confluence of you being a first-time pastor into a situation that was very challenging with how dysfunctional churches can be and the unreasonable expectations we have of pastors. You've put together all of these systemic factors to say these were ultimate causal factors that came together around my anxiety. Or if you look at the world today, you can say, well, it is a complex, the world is uncertain, there's a lot of changes. If you follow the research of Jonathan Haidt, he would say for teens especially, the rise of smartphones and technology is a huge causal factor in the rise of anxiety combined with social media. Right? You put all that together, you get a perfect storm of anxiety hitting our communities and perhaps teens especially. So that's one way you can ask the question, why Katrina or why any catastrophe hit us? But you can also look at this picture. You know what this picture of? The levees. And the levees were built in New Orleans recognizing that hurricanes were a natural part of existence in New Orleans. It was natural. You should have expected hurricanes to happen, right? And that's why you need to erect structures to respond to the hurricanes that came up. But why? Another reason you guys was, why did the levees break? That's really what caused the catastrophic damage of the storm. And it turns out what the storm revealed was that the levees were constructed on very faulty principles, they were constructed at the foundational level in a poor, shoddy fashion. They were built wrongly, right? The structures that they had built to respond to a natural human occurrence were constructed poorly. This is what I would argue is happening for Christians and anxiety right now. That what is happening now, we can explain and go through all the big causal factors, but what it is revealing, this moment, this era is revealing, is that our spiritual levees are broken. And in fact, they were constructed from the beginning on wrong foundations, right? That what we have erected in response to anxiety needs to get rebuilt. And it starts with how we define anxiety. If we define anxiety, or if we construct kind of in our minds and in our theology that anxiety is a problem, well then what follows from that? What do you build on top of? Once you understand something is a problem, what is it that you're looking for as the next layer on top of a problem? What do you want in response to a problem? A solution, exactly. Once you say something's a problem, this is what you're looking for, is you're looking for a solution. And as good, efficient Americans as we are, what is a satisfying solution? What must a satisfying solution do to the problem? Eliminate it, right? Once we say it, this is how our anxiety levee is built. It's problem, it's a problem, well, we need a solution. What kind of solution? A solution that eliminates it. And this has dominated Christian responses to anxiety, is the elimination desire, right? And there are two big sort of constructions that we construct to eliminate. One is called pray it away, broadly speaking, and the second is prescribe it away. Right? Pray it away or prescribe. So pray it away is where we construct anxiety so much as a problem that it's a spiritual problem. It's a character flaw, a lack of faith, maybe even a sin. This is where I would argue, misread verses like Philippians 4:6, and we interpret that to say, oh, that means if you do not be anxious about anything. That means if you are anxious, it means you're in sin or you lack faith. If you want to hear my take on that, that's in chapter 1 of the Anxiety Opportunity, my exegesis of Philippians 4:6. But that's the essential view, right? It's a problem that we have to spiritually somehow make go away. Then we can grow spiritually. But it's a problem, right? And this is what I was laboring with as that senior pastor. Right? Because what comes with that is like, well, if it's a sin or a character flaw or lack of faith, I can't admit that. I can't actually, sort of just tell people this is what I'm doing. This is what your senior pastor is dealing with, right? So this is why I kept it so hidden and so secret. And then that's what it built and built and built until it overwhelmed me. Now, there are increasingly more churches in the Christian community that don't stigmatize anxiety as a sin. or as a flaw. And they'll say, no, it's a natural, it's a human, it's mental health. We should take care of it. Let's normalize mental health. But the response then is to prescribe it away, right? It's really to outsource it to secular mental health for them to take care of. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's good in that. I have benefited from anti-anxiety medication and from therapy. But even the secular profession, the secular mental health profession, has fallen into this construction of that anxiety is a problem that is meant to be eliminated. And therefore, they approach prescriptions, whether it's therapy or medication, as well. The goal here is to try to get rid of it, right? And secular mental health professionals themselves are recognizing this is a faulty construction, right? That's actually making the problem worse. This is Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tuare. She's one of the nation's leading researchers on anxiety. She's not a Christian. All right. But she has written this. I believe that we mental health professionals have made a terrible mistake. We've convinced people that anxiety is a dangerous affliction and that the solution is to eliminate it, as we do with other diseases, right? But feeling anxious isn't the problem. The problem is that we don't understand how to respond constructively to anxiety. That's why it's increasingly hard to know how to feel good. So even secular mental health professionals like Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tuare recognizing if we view this as a problem to eliminate, we're off on the wrong track. We're going to go off into a way that we're expecting people that it's a problem that is to be eliminated in our lives. So what's a different way to construct this? What's a different levy for anxiety? I would argue or propose this. Rather than viewing it as a problem, solution, elimination, I think Scripture invites us to look at it as this, as opportunity, the anxiety opportunity. Because once you construct it at the foundational level that anxiety actually is an opportunity, then your next response is, well, as every good opportunity, let me check out that opportunity. Like an immigrant, you're more posed into the opportunity of an experience rather than the potential loss of an experience. And so you want to go through that doorway. And once you go through that doorway, you hope there will be growth, right? Anxiety opportunity that leads to a doorway that we go through, not around, not avoid, not to eliminate it, but go through it like a doorway, going through anxiety with the belief and hope there is growth on the other side of this. Why do I believe this is so true, that anxiety, in fact, is our primary opportunity for spiritual growth, and why we need to reframe anxiety in this way? I believe because once we do that, we will experience that approaching Jesus is the very doorway, right? It's the very doorway. That once we are able to not try to eliminate anxiety, but go through it, we will actually experience a growth in our relationship with Jesus. Why do I think that? Well, let's ask the question, well, how are people supposed to approach Jesus in the first place, right? And let's look at the gospel evidence. How are people supposed to approach Jesus? If we believe that, as Christians anyways that are in this room, that Jesus is the place, is the opportunity for spiritual growth. Well, to answer this question, I looked at the Gospel of Mark, and I did a study where I took everybody who approached Jesus, right? But I did a screen, people who approach Jesus in good faith. So I screen out like the Pharisees or his enemies. People in good faith approach Jesus, and they approach Jesus personally. So not as large nameless crowds, but as people, as persons. All right, so when you look at that, apply that screen to the Gospel of Mark, there are about 29 such approaches that fit that screen. Of that 29 approaches, 15 of those shown strong textual evidence of anxiety. By that I mean there's something in the story that strongly conveys anxiety. People were in fear. Jesus responds, do not fear. Or there's the verb, so-and-so implore Jesus, which is a verb that suggests great emotional distress in coming to Jesus and asking for something. So 15 already shows strong textual evidence of anxiety. Another 12 show possible but not definitive evidence of anxiety. So a classic example of this is in Mark 2 rather, the paralytics, the four friends who bring the paralytics to Jesus. Right, there's no text in there that says they're anxious, but they're they're destroying a stranger's roof to get their way and to cut to the front of the line. That's not like the posture of somebody who's calm and collected, right? Right. So there's like 12 stories like that where I think there's some anxiety there, right? So there's only actually 2 examples of approaches that show no sign of anxiety, both found in Mark 14. One is the woman who anoints Jesus with the ointment at his death. And she's clearly meant to be an outlier because Jesus says, whenever the gospel is told, this woman will be told in memory of me because she's like an outlier, right? The other in Mark 14, which is Mark means it as a kind of ironic contrast, is Peter approaching Jesus and saying, the other guys will you can't count on them, but me, you can count on me, right? Right, because I'm not anxious about this. I got this, right? That's clearly meant to be irony because a few passages later, Peter is very anxious, right, in the face of persecution. So really, the vast majority, you could say almost all approaches to Jesus are characterized by anxiety. The scriptures make clear, how we get closer to Jesus, how we approach Jesus is not by getting rid of our anxiety, not by eliminating our anxiety first, and then we can grow spiritually. It's a doorway. Anxiety is the doorway. It's the place of meeting. It's how we approach Jesus. We have to, as any doorway is, we have to go through it, not eliminate it, not go around it. Right? So anxiety is the doorway. And there's any number of approaches to Jesus that these passages characterize. So if you look at those passages, 8 suffer from health anxiety, 7 from spiritual anxiety, 6 social anxiety, 4 physical safety anxiety, 2 provision anxiety. Right, so all kinds of anxiety are opportunities to come to Jesus. And by the way, if you know the immigrant experience, all of these characterize the immigrant experience, right? All of these types of anxieties, which is why the immigration anxiety is a perfect opportunity for growth. So we come to Jesus through our anxiety, and then Jesus, once we come through Jesus to Jesus through our anxiety, Jesus brings us to be present to the Father. That is Jesus' role for us, to help us to be present to the Father. And let me just say a few words about how anxiety helps us come to Jesus, and then in our anxiety, Jesus brings us to be present to the Father. Let's talk about to be present first. Why is Jesus bringing us present so important? Well, look, we see in Matthew 6, one of Jesus' seminal teachings on anxiety, where he says, therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious, right, about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Notice the time horizon of that anxiety. What is the time? It's the future. It's will, right? What you will eat, what you will drink, what you will. They're anticipating the loss of what they will eat, drink, or wear in the future. And Jesus here diagnoses, yes, that's at the heart of anxiety, is the fear of a future loss. Notice the time frame that Jesus wants to shift us to. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, the future, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for this day is its own trouble. Jesus is trying to get his listeners who are anxious about some future loss to come back to the present. And that's one of our first spiritual responses to anxiety for ourselves and for the people we lead, is to call them not to be the future, but to the present, right? Because that's what anxiety is. Anxiety, you think of anxiety as a hijack to the future. Anxiety wants us to get us to live in an imaginary future that does not exist yet. It only exists in reality. It only exists in our mind, right? And because it doesn't exist in concrete reality, our mind then can generate all sorts of scenarios of loss. And so as long as we live in the future, we are getting hijacked into the terrain of anxiety, right? And so what do we do? What's the first response to the hijack that anxiety is? Well, we reverse the hijack, right? We be present. We come back from the future to the present, and we lower the hold of anxiety has on us. And Jesus gives us many models of how to be present with him. One of them is very simple. It's simple. It's called the mindful breath. Right? Now, many of you probably have practiced mindful breathing in other contexts, right? At work, in an beginning a meeting, or maybe in a yoga class or something like that. And perhaps those of you, especially from a Christian background, are like, Can I do this? Is this okay? Is this a new agey sort of thing? I'm here to tell you that mindful breathing actually has Jesus origins, right? And you can see this because actually it's in mindful breathing that Jesus conveys his presence to anxious disciples. It's in mindful breathing that Jesus conveys his presence to anxious disciples. We see this in how Jesus, from the very first time, conveyed the Holy Spirit, his very presence, right? This is found in John 20. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, they were very anxious. We know it because their doors were locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, right? So they're huddling in anxiety. And then Jesus comes and stands among them, and he's trying to address their anxiety. He says, "Peace be with you." And then notice what he does next. Jesus says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." So he's bringing presence into the Father. How does he do that? And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." This is not a throwaway line, this action of breathing. It is mindful. Jesus is doing it mindfully. He's tapping into a long tradition where God's presence is experienced and expressed as breath, as ruach. Right? When Genesis 1, it goes back to Genesis 1, Ruach Elohim, the presence of God breathing over all of creation. Jesus is, as he's giving his very presence, he's breathing mindfully with them, on them, with them, in them. Right? And this is why the practice of mindful breath has deep Christian roots. Right? And so I thought for just like 3 minutes, we're just going to do that now. We're just going to do that now. So I want to invite, we're just do a quick experience of Jesus-centered mindful breathing. If you're not yourself follower of Jesus, you can either just watch or you can experiment and join in, whatever you'd like. What I invite you to do is sit up. Right, so try to sit up straight so you're not slouching, so that you can feel your feet on the floor, feel your body resting on your seat. Now close your eyes. And then what I want you to do is to take one breath, and what I want you to do is to breathe, try to breathe from the abdomen. So put your hand on your abdomen, okay? And what I want you to do is to try to practice breathing through your nose, mindfully, because when we're anxious, we breathe through our mouth. So breathe through your nose and take one breath where you feel the abdomen expand. So not from the chest, which is what we do when we're breathing, when we're anxious. Breathe from the abdomen. So close your eyes, take one breath. Feel the abdomen expand. Now release it. One more time. Now I want you to try a trick where you're actually breathing in at a count of like 3 or 4 and exhaling double that. Right? So breathe in like 3 and then exhale a count of 6, let's say, all right? Try that. Now we're going to add one more little twist. As you breathe in, I want you to invite you to just say the word Jesus. Okay? Or if you're not comfortable saying that, you can choose a different word that you prefer. But I invite you to just say that you're breathing in the presence of God come to you through Jesus. Do it one more time. Okay, let's open our eyes. If you were really engaging in that practice for that last 1 minute, 60, 90 seconds, you were not feeling anxious. Right? You may be now starting to have all sorts of thoughts creeping into you. But while you were doing that, because you were present, you were not in the future, right? And you were not thinking about some loss, you were just in the presence. In the presence of Jesus. Right? So this is just a taste of some of the many ways in which there are deeply helpful spiritual practices that help us to be present with God in our anxiety. And again, I encourage you, if you haven't, I write about all of these practices, or many of these practices in the book, The Anxiety Opportunity. So as spiritual leaders, let's look for ways to help our people get present, whether it's mindful breathing or other ways, to draw our people from getting hijacked into the future, to living in the presence and the present presence of Jesus. Right? That's our role. That's our job as pastors, as leaders. Let me say one last thing, that Jesus brings us to be present to the Father. And this is another opportunity that anxiety brings to us, to be present to the Father himself personally. Let's go back to this passage again. In addition to that, Jesus is emphasizing the nature of anxiety as the future, the will. There's another repeated emphasis here, which is the what, right? Jesus is talking about what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will put on. Because they're afraid of a loss of what's, of food, drink, clothing, and so forth, right? So when we fear the loss of what's our natural temptation to want? More wants. We want some assurance we're going to get those what's, right? We want a reliable supply of what's. We want some scenario that's like the what's are short. But notice that Jesus does not promise that. Jesus doesn't say, look, you're afraid of what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will. So let me lay out for you for the next 90 days your wardrobe, right? Over the next 90 days, what your wine cellar is going to look like, or what your menu is going to look like. He doesn't respond to the anxiety, to our desire for a reliable provision of future what's with that future scenario, right? Instead, and that's the thing, right? And that's the thing. Any future scenario is a what, right? When we want a scenario, it's a scenario of a what that we want in that world. Instead, Jesus says, look, for the Gentiles seek after all these things, these what's, right? And your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. Jesus is trying to evoke a shift here from our desire, natural desire in the face of anxiety to want what's. And he's saying, I'm giving you something better. In fact, I'm giving you someone better. I'm bringing you present to the heavenly Father. Right? And that there's a difference between the what of the Father, what the Father supplies us, and the who of the Father. Right? God is not just a heavenly supply chain. God is a Father. Presence. Those of us who are parents know how diminished our parenting experience is when we relate to our kids solely as a supply chain, right? We want so much more to be with our kids than just a supplier of their next need of what. We want to be present. We want a relationship with them. We want to be a who with our kids. That's how God is. That's how our Father God is. And anxiety is actually an opportunity to actually invite us to look, is the only satisfactory response I have is a what? Is a scenario that eliminates this fear that I have lost? Or can I actually enter into this experience, into a deeper relationship with the who of the Father? And I'll leave you with this because I want to encourage you that especially for those of you, let me shift and focus especially on the pastors and Christian leaders out there. That's really your special role in all of this. In all of this intersection of Christians, anxiety, and immigration, your special role is to call your people to the who of the Father. You will learn today various ways to help them think about the what's of the border, the what's of job policy. That's good, that's helpful, it's important for you to learn all of that. But you need to channel all that and realize, how do I take all of that and at the end of the day, stick to my core mission and vocation, which is in this, my job is to call people to the who. You're not going to be experts on the what various scenarios that happen in the future. And by the way, anybody who tells you that immigration will not involve any loss of any sort is selling you a false bill of goods. It just involves loss of all for the receiving end, on the immigrating end of things, right? So our answer to the anxieties of immigration cannot be, let me give you a scenario where there's no loss involved, right? Our answer as Christians has to be, there's a way to walk through the anxieties of that loss, and that walking through involves calling people to the very presence of the Father, that they, as immigrants and as communities receiving immigrants, all share a Father who loves them dearly, who will ultimately take care of them, which does not mean insure them against all loss, right? But will take care of them and ultimately will be with them to the very end. That's our mission, that's our job, and thank you for being part of that.
So thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have all of you up here, and I do have a series of questions for all of you. I am going to start with you, Yvonne, because I think the question I'm going to ask you are going to kind of form the foundation for what we're going to talk about. So you are a clinician, clinical counselor, and so we've heard Curtis talk about anxiety. So can you share, first of all, share a little bit about where you live and what kind of work you do?
So I live in Akron, Ohio, which is about 2 hours north of here. I've been counseling for about, 20 years. And a lot of the work that I do right now is counseling in the church setting. So I counsel people that identify as believers. And so we walk through anxiety and depression, and how do you reflect that in your lived experience as a believer of Christ. What's the second part?
What kind of work do you do?
Oh. And then the other part of what I do is I'm the director, I was the director of the counseling program at Ashland Theological Seminary. I've stepped into interim dean role at the seminary for a year. And so where a lot of my passion lies is to train the next generation of Christian counselors.
Okay, thank you. So as a clinician, I do want to ask you a couple of questions about anxiety. So could you talk to us a little bit about what generalized anxiety is, and how do we become aware of it?
So generalized anxiety is just that overall feeling of angst where, and it's, in order for it to be diagnosed clinically, it needs to be excessive. So a lot of us have those moments where we are worrying about things, or we, especially after COVID, a lot of people really started to have a lot more anxieties about being around people, about washing our hands, about things being clean all the time. Just interacting with one another in general just became more challenging. When we cross over into diagnosis, it's to the point that it negatively impacts your life. So the fact that sometimes now after COVID, we walk into a room with this many people and we all kind of just take a little step back like, it's gonna be okay. That's a normal response. But if you're someone that walks in and then you start shaking uncontrollably and you have to go back out and you have to do a lot of self-talk, then we're probably crossing over a line. One of the ways that we can determine if generalized anxiety, so that's anxiety about finances, anxiety about yourself, your kids, grandkids, siblings, parents, spouse, friends, just the world in general, when it crosses over, if it negatively impacts your work. So you can't move through your day-to-day activities without the thoughts coming uncontrollably, and you can't, even if the thoughts come in, you also cannot figure out how to distill them, how to bring them down into a state of this is okay, and I can walk myself through. So I walk into a room with this many people and I start to feel my heart racing. You ask, how can you tell? So your breathing pattern starts to change, your heart pattern starts to change, your palms might get sweaty, your thoughts start racing, your mouth might get dry. Those are just some of the physical manifestations of anxiety. And if you can't self-talk your way through it, of how do I bring myself back down, that it's going to be okay, we're all sitting in reasonable distance from one another, or I can sit in this space or whatever.
So the next question I have, I think you've answered some of this, but we'll see if you want to expand on it, is, how do we mediate? When that happens to us, how do we mediate that? And then the second part of the question is, what is the role of self-care in managing our anxiety?
So one of the ways to mediate it is actually the exercise that you all just went through. It's a form of grounding or mindfulness activities. So doing those kinds of things where you take deep breaths. One of the grounding exercises that I like to teach my clients is it's the big five. So look around for 5 things you see, listen for 5 things you can hear, touch or feel inside your body 3 things that you can feel, 2 things that you can smell, and then 1 thing that you can taste. And so just doing that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 helps people become more grounded. It's really, when we are in an anxious state, we are so focused on what's causing us anxiety that we forget to be in the moment. And so the breathing exercises or those grounding exercises are really good about helping us be in the moment. The reason self-care is important is because self-care is a lifestyle. And so life is full of anxieties. Jesus tells us in this life you will have trouble. And so you're going to struggle, right? That's just part of the human experience. One of the reasons I love the book is because it talks about anxiety as an opportunity. Before that, I've not heard anybody say that. So I was really excited to see that. People would look at me crazy when I'd be like, but it can be okay. And then you wrote a whole book. And so I'm like, now I can just be like, read this book. It's going to be okay. And so self-care is to help you mediate what is happening in life in general. So we're going to have anxiety, but if I have in place certain things to take care of myself, that's what self-care is, care of yourself, then the anxiety doesn't have to be debilitating. It can be something that happens. I have tools to maintain, but when something comes in that will take my anxiety to a different level, then I have other things that I can pull in to help. But as long as I'm doing that platform, I will always be able to lean back into that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to move to Pastor Felix Muniz. Felix, it's good to see you. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you to be here.
And so could you share a little bit about where you live and tell us what you do and a little bit about your ministry?
Well, we're probably going to be here for about an hour if I do that. I pastor 2 churches. I live in Cleveland, pastor a church in the west side of Cleveland. I also pastor a church at Grafton, and I am also the founder and executive director of the Galilean Theological Center. So,
very good. And that is Felix, you and I know each other, and that is a very short version of everything you do.
yep.
So what I want to ask you is to talk a little bit about what is happening in Cleveland with the influx of immigrants, a lot of it having to do with the repeal of Title 42
Yes.
and some of the other things that are going on.
Yeah, it's interesting what's happening in Cleveland. After Title 42 was lifted by Biden, over 30,000 individuals come from Venezuela, from Nicaragua, from Haiti, from Cuba, to major cities like Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, but the cities are not ready for that. There's a lot of needs to be addressed. These people come with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and the pastors, especially speaking from a Latinx context, we're not ready to deal with these issues. I mean, they're just pouring into our churches. These individuals need legal aid, they need medical assistance, they need housing, they need mental health services. So we're overwhelmed with people coming in, so we need to reach out and see how we could bridge the gap, but the churches alone can't do it by themselves.
So let me pick up on that. What is most helpful for the churches that are doing this work? What would be helpful for you in terms of resources from the wider communities?
Well, I think the biggest thing is philanthropists needs to come on board. Social service organizations needs to come on board. We need to create hubs in our major cities so that we could address these needs with these immigrants. The other thing is, one of the things that I do as a pastor, is the only way that I know how to be a pastor is to walk with them. Many of them don't have transportation. They have appointments to go to. They need to go to court, and they cannot pay lawyer's fee. So we need to really ask philanthropists to step up and build collaboration within churches so that we could help them meet these needs. I have a group of individuals that came with me. They're sitting right at the table right here. Will you please stand? That's just a glimpse. We got about 30 or 40 families in our churches. And talking about anxiety, we get anxious because we're not ready for this. So we ask people to step forward and collaborate and join us to meet their needs as we move forward.
Bless you.
Thank you for being here with us today. So Felix, you're a pastor of a church that is made up largely of immigrants. And we're talking about anxiety today. My question is, can you talk about the anxiety that your congregation has over the current conversation that we're having in this country over immigration?
Yes, anxiety comes from both sides, from the receiving end and from the immigrants themselves. One of the things that we face a lot, again, we lack resources, but also the fact that when they come in, we hear a lot of news about stigma, and a lot of stigma goes around, thinking that they're criminals, thinking that they're drug dealers and drug traffickers. That's not the case. These are people with talents, these are people with gifts, and these are people that could really make our city vibrant and help us to build a city that is safe to live. These people also are professionals. They just cannot exercise their profession because they don't have no documentation. But they bring a lot of gifts and talents. And I think one of the things that we are looking at from a pastoral perspective is that this is exactly the vision that we see in John. A multitude of all nations, languages, and cultures coming together. And I think sometimes we miss that. And one of our colleagues said that they bring the honor and glory into the Lord. So they bring talents, they bring gifts. So the stigma needs to stop, and we need to address that. From a pastor's perspective, we get anxious because our phone does not stop ringing. And our pastors are just so anxious because they don't have the time needed or to delegate some individuals in their churches to help them out.
Thank you, Felix. Rich, I'd like to go to you next and ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry.
Sure. I'm the kind of person that caused Curtis the anxiety that forced him. It was, my type. I'm the founding pastor of Vineyard Columbus, where you are, and handed the church off 2 years ago. And Curtis was actually, I was thinking that as you were speaking, I was thinking, gosh, we handed it off right on the tail end of COVID and all the stuff, and we were a growing church and all of that, and then I handed it off, and I'm going to ask if he's sleeping. I will. So I'm founding pastor of Vineyard Columbus. So I pastored this church for 34 years. I'm still on staff here. We started a residency program where we're training new pastors, church planters, and campus pastors. So spending time doing that.
Wonderful, thank you very much. From your experience, how should pastors navigate through divisive issues like immigration with their congregations? What have you found that is most effective?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts there, but just a few thoughts. The worst time to navigate a divisive issue is when you're in the crisis. So, if the first time you ever speak about race is when George Floyd was murdered, that's probably a little too late. And it's going to create more problems for you and for the church. And even if so you want to speak about issues in non-crisis times, to just lay a foundation for this in your congregation, that you were speaking about justice regularly. We're speaking about race, we're speaking about immigration or the environment or whatever it is, that are contentious issues, we want to do that in calm times so that when the crisis comes, and it will come, the congregation has heard you express those themes. So you're not just doing a hot take. You're responding out of, and even then it creates problems. We had problems as we spoke about George Floyd's murder, and lots of folks in the church were joining the protests, and others were upset by that. But there was a foundation, so we didn't lose the church. So that's one thing. Second, it is important, pastors, if that we do speak. The real tragedy regarding immigration is that the vast majority of my tribe, which are evangelicals, I know many of you are not that, but evangelical is a theological term, not a political term. But the vast majority of evangelicals have gotten their information about immigration from the evening news. They haven't gotten it from the pulpit. And so they've never heard even one sermon. That the statistics are really depressing. Less than 20% of evangelicals say they've heard one sermon on immigration. Just one sermon, not even a steady drumbeat. So pastors, we're very good at reading the map. We know this is sensitive, and so we avoid difficult topics, but we're called to preach the whole counsel of God, and so we need to address that. I'll stop talking, but we can talk about perhaps the way that we speak to anxious people also. So,
Well, okay. You just asked the question.
oh, okay.
So how do you do that? How do you speak to anxious people over these issues?
Yeah, and I think Curtis laid such a great foundation because, our tendency as pastors, and particularly my wiring, I was trained in law. I taught law at Ohio State. My tendency is to just overwhelm people with arguments. and just, if you have a brain in your head, here's 20 reasons why you ought to agree with me. What do you say? And that doesn't speak to the anxiety at all, does it? The reason why people are making decisions is not because they're dumb or because they don't have the reasons, they haven't heard your arguments. And Jonathan Haidt, that Curtis mentioned, did a great book about a decade ago called The Righteous Mind. And he uses a couple of illustrations that I think are really helpful. If you haven't gotten it, it's a big book, but it's definitely worth reading. But he describes our minds, we have two parts of the brain. One is the prefrontal cortex, the rational, deliberative part of the brain. The other is, what we would call intuition or gut feeling, that sort of thing. He says that you can compare the brain to a man riding an elephant, okay? And if you have that image, a man riding an elephant, the elephant pretty much goes where it wants to go. The man exercises a little bit of control, but basically the elephant goes where it wants to go. People's gut, their emotions, the reasons they form things are not because of the man that is the prefrontal cortex. We make decisions about hot button issues, politics, immigration, race, based on the community we're a part of. We base those decisions on anxieties, on lots of other feelings other than, all of the rational things we've heard. So if we're going to speak to people, we've got to speak to the elephant, not to the man. We need to speak to people's emotional life. Why are you where you are? And part of that is listening. Part of that is being genuinely curious. Jonathan Haidt gives a number of strategies for addressing anxious people. It's not that you never give reasons, you never offer facts, but that's not the primary issue. So if somebody says, we need to build a wall, Or President Trump was the best president in our history, is better than Abe Lincoln. Great. I'm not going to be able to overcome that by giving you 12 reasons why the wall shouldn't be built or President Trump might not be the best president. That won't work. I've got to speak to people's, core intuitions.
Thank you so much for that. I have one more question for you.
Sure.
And that has to do with dreamers, the
Yeah.
ministry to dreamers, advocacy of dreamers
Right.
in your church. And along with that, is there a story of a dreamer that you might be able to tell us that speaks to the anxieties that dreamers live with?
Yeah, sure. So the church has been real involved with immigrants. We have a nonprofit immigration counseling center here, one of two in the city, and we have a free legal clinic and a medical clinic and so on that ministers to immigrants. So we've made a real commitment to immigrants. We have over 120 nations represented in the church. So in the immigration counseling, in our immigration counseling services, we've done lots of work with immigrants and DACA claims and all of that. And just one woman who, great student, went through college, wanted to go to medical school. But as a result of her undocumented, she's because of DACA, will not be deported, but she can't go to medical school. So her future is blocked. And so we're blocking the gifts, as Pastor was saying, that there's so much that could be offered, but we're blocking those things by current, this ambiguous place that immigrants find themselves.
Thank you. Chuck, I have a couple questions for you. And the first one is, as with all the panelists, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live, what kind of work you do. And can you tell us a little bit in that question, tell us about the story of starting Undivided?
Sure can. So first of all, just honored to be here. Curtis, thank you for the invitation, and others for being here. It feels really special. I live in the new sports mecca of Ohio, Cincinnati. Give me some grace. Give me some grace. I know. Give me some grace. We actually have a halfway decent baseball team right now. We have a soccer team that is doing really well right now. And this is the best time to be a Bengals fan because it's preseason. So the Bengals have not done anything to make you but I actually am from Philadelphia, moved to Cincinnati, but I've lived in Cincinnati for over 20 years with my wife and my 3 kids. And really are part of a community, Crossroads Church there, and I've been a pastor at Crossroads for many years. I'm a teaching pastor still at the church, but in 2020, I stepped away from that to lead and launch an organization called Undivided, which does racial healing and justice work and really helping followers of Jesus, people of faith, activate themselves into the work of racial healing and justice. And so it's interesting when I think about how that all got started, I really do think about anxiety. Because, and Curtis, you may have even heard me share this story before, there was a day when I recognized an Apple iWatch feature, which is that if you have your heart rate go too high, your iPhone actually through the watch can call 911 on your behalf. I learned that when I was running across a bridge in Cincinnati. I love running, I hate bridges, and I hate heights. And literally when I got on the other side of the bridge, my phone and my watch were barking at me, and I recognized it when I picked up the phone. On the other end, a woman said, 911, what's your emergency? Like it literally had called 911. And I go back to that story because I think whenever you talk about, to your point, Pastor Rich, whenever you talk about race or immigration with people of faith, I think your iPhone starts to go off. That same kind of anxiety starts to happen. And so what Undivided really has become is a way for people to engage in that conversation that lowers the temperature by rooting it in faith and rooting it in relationships. And what I would say is whether it be immigration or race or other places where we find ourselves divided, the followers of Jesus have a tool, 2 tools that I think work together really powerfully. And that is formation and then activation. And so when I talk about formation, I think about what Pastor Rich said again, that, the first time that you hear about race in your church shouldn't be when there's a crisis. The Bible has a lot to say about the other. It has a lot to say about the nations. And so how do we begin to get a view of what Jesus actually has to say about these issues? But I also know in my own faith that anything I've only read in the book, even if the book is the Bible, has not changed my life just because I read it in the book. In the context of community, when I put that book into practice, right, when I live it out, those are the things where I would say I've seen maturity. I think that I know more how to live like Jesus in this area. And so what Undivided really has done is created a space for churches to do that work of formation and activation as it relates to justice and as it relates to their local context.
Thank you very much for that. Your comments about formation, I was thinking about what Curtis said in his presentation, that pastors, their primary job is less about the what, more about the who, right? Bringing folks into that relationship with Christ. So we've already talked about how high anxiety is, and the reality of it is we have so much mistrust. So how do we help break through that mistrust through these kinds of conversations, particularly when we're talking about topics of, say, racial justice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, it really boils down to relationships. Relationships are how we build trust. Brian Stevenson, who's known for leading the Equal Justice Initiative, he's the subject of the movie Just Mercy, says that we have to get proximate to the problems we're trying to solve. And what I would say is that starts by getting proximate to the people and recognizing them not as a subject that we have to help as much as it's, hey, how do we enter into relationships so we can learn and build together? Interesting example with Undivided, we launched it at our church, and the first 1,200 people who signed up were in, they were committed. We did some pre-survey just to understand where people were, and we found that of that 1,200 people who were in and committed to go to a different place on a conversation around race, nearly 50% of them had never had a person of a different race over at their house for dinner. So think about that. Think about how challenging it is to enter a space and have a challenging conversation when many people in the room haven't even had that very intimate experience of just sharing a meal in their home with someone of a different race. And so, and this is where I think, again, and I know that not everybody here is related to a church or connected to a community of faith, but I do think this is, again, where communities of faith have an advantage and an opportunity, because we have the opportunity to bring people into intimate spaces who have very different lived experiences. And so the question is then, how do we leverage that to build trust? But I do think at the core, that trust starts with shared relationships, proximity.
Thank you. So Curtis, I want to ask you a question. So just for self-disclosure, Curtis was not supposed to be on this panel, but we asked him at the last minute if he would do that, and so he was gracious enough to come back up on stage. I read your book, The Anxiety Opportunity, as well, and one of the things I greatly appreciated is the hopefulness in that book. It is certainly a book I recommend to folks. So based on that sense of hopefulness and what you've heard here on the panel, how do we lean into that hope? Because ultimately, for those of us that are Christians, we're hopeful people.
I think it begins by anchoring with more clearly, what is it that we are hoping for? And that's actually anxiety's opportunity to clarify that for us, especially as Christians. Because if the hope is, things are going to work out in a way that I don't experience loss, that is not actually the Christian hope. Right? The Christian hope is not loss avoidance. Right? That's not the hope. And although we actually slip into that, when we meet anxious people or we deal with, we can say, God will take care of it. And that's true. But I think what we either mean to convey or is being received is, God will take care of it in a way that you do not experience any loss, right? And if any of you have just lived life, right, and you have prayed in anxious times for a scenario of loss avoidance, that is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed in Scripture, and anybody who's lived any bit of life
knows that is not how this God thing works, right? So our hope is not that everything is going to work out in a way that we do not experience loss. That is not the Christian hope. It is not loss avoidance. The Christian hope that gets clarified through anxiety is loss restoration. Another word for that is resurrection, right? And resurrection is not loss avoidance. Resurrection requires loss. It requires death. That's the very definition of resurrection. It is restoration through loss. You have to go through the loss. You have to go through death, right? So the anxiety is an opportunity for us to clarify the gospel. The gospel is not, you'll be okay, God will make everything okay, such that you never experience loss. The gospel is Jesus has died and has been raised from the dead, and therefore has carved a way to go through all of the losses of life. He's gone through it himself. And if we follow him, we can follow him through loss to resurrection, restoration, that we can experience foretastes of in our life, but we experience the fullness of that in the final resurrection to come. That's the gospel. And anxiety forces us to clarify that, right, for ourselves and for the people that we're counseling and preaching to. So I would say and this is why my book, the last quarter of the book is on the resurrection and trying to clarify what is the resurrection for Christians, that it is not a disembodied go away to heaven in a disembodied soul. It is the restoration of things and realities and the bodies that we have lost and are losing and will lose. And when Jesus returns to this earth to restore and heal all things. So that's the hope. That's the real ultimate hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. As we close this panel, I'm wondering if we could just go down the line. Maybe, Chuck, we could start with you. And in this area of immigration, what makes you hopeful?
Yeah, I would say what makes me hopeful is, quite frankly, gatherings like this. I really believe that you're here because you have a vision and a calling to help lead others to a place where we can have healthy conversations around immigration. And as I think about what you said, Pastor, in terms of philanthropy. And I think philanthropy can come in a couple of different ways. One is financial philanthropy, but also the philanthropy of presence, the philanthropy of gifts and talents in this room that are being leveraged to see the immigration opportunity, not a problem, as a way to create a richer, a more diverse, and a more powerful America. And I see and have hope for that because I think people in this room are looking to cut through some of the talking points that put you in one camp or the other and come up with real solutions that actually value and center people.
Thank you.
I would not be very original. Similarly, I came here because I thought this was important, but I actually am walking away realizing, I think God brought me here to inject a sense of hope in me because I hear what all of you are doing. I'm like, those are signs that God is at work. And none of these stories that you've heard from up front, they don't happen unless God is real and present and active in people's lives. Which doesn't mean that with the work that people are doing up here or out there are going to solve the problem and make it go away. But they're signposts. They're signposts that God is active, and therefore the God who had promised that there will come a day when all will be restored, that God is real. And so I take great hope in just hearing everything that you're doing. I'm sure that I'll hear from those of you when I talked with you on our breaks and so forth as real signs of hope that God is active and present and real. And I hope you take that away from today as well.
So helpful. So great to hear you guys. And just one thought, and that is, when we look back at history, things can change so rapidly and unexpectedly. When something just seems impossible, and if you looked at it at the front end, this dam is not going to break. And then suddenly, God can shift the ground so quickly and speed things up so rapidly. And we just don't know, what that moment is. So we labor. when I think about how nations open in terms of revival from hard ground to literally hundreds of thousands or millions of people coming to know Christ, it can happen just in a moment. And suddenly, you know, the Berlin Wall falls and Eastern Europe is open, and suddenly churches are springing up all over Iran and so on. The same thing can happen with immigration. So
I always said that challenges could be turned into opportunities. And when I look at immigration, I really see that picture of divine movement where we all could come together, of all nations, of all languages, and really, really display what the kingdom of God is all about. And when I talk about the kingdom, I'm talking about K-I-N, how we are related to each other in the midst of all differences. That makes me hopeful.
Immigration makes me hopeful to have these kinds of conversations, because I think a lot of the issue is our anxiety and our fears. And so if we can find some way to navigate through this, then we really will be the people that are, as God has called us to be, without fear. And we will lean more into the Spirit.
Thank you for listening. Our talk and panel about anxiety immigration. Thanks for joining us, and join us again next week when once again we'll gather around the campfire.